excellent connection. There we go. Pop you out. Let me get my Kindle open. You're gonna have to get me MDZS when we start.
Yeah.
I don't have money to buy that whole thing. Alright, what happened
Is it
last time?
on?
I'm sure it's on Kindle. What happened last
Um,
time?
um, they got to Ling Wen's place.
Yeah.
They found Ling Wen needed a little bit of a break from wearing the brocade immortal,
Mm-hmm.
and so they went inside and looked through a chest to find the robe because there's so many robes.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a little bit of a silly gay moment, as they do.
Yep.
Um, and then they couldn't find the robe, and then finally Ling Wen comes in, is like,
What the fuck?
"Come on, man, come on, man," and Hua Chong stops her from
Communicating.
communicating, and then the robe is actually what Shay Lian's wearing because it's shifted form,
Yeah.
and
And he punched Hua Chang.
yeah, he punched Hua Chong.
And then Hua Chang was like, Shilian was like, don't do that, don't hurt yourself to spare others. And then Hua Chang was like, you have no right to say that to me. Alright, so now he is in the robes. They're still looking for the state preceptor of Shenle, Mei Nianqing, because he is being held captive in the palace of Lingwen. Let me get a lozenge so I don't have to get up later. Alrighty. So just the most important info is just that Shilian has the Brocade Immortal on, but that's not going to come up just yet. Alright. So that ends with... Yes, really. Why use other methods if I can solve the problem by taking a beating? That's your bad influence on me, Hua Cheng replied. Shilian waved him off. Never mind, San Lang, let's not talk about this anymore. Let's look at these robes. He tugged at the white robe's hem, feeling deeply frustrated. This was just great. They had definitely found the Brocade Immortal, but now they had to think of a way to take it off. Chapter 118. Centuries of Pain, Millennia of Suffering. There was definitely no way the robe could be burned now that it was being worn, lest Shilian be burned along with it. I'll just keep wearing it for now, Shilian suggested. It's not like it can suck my blood, and Lingwen shouldn't be able to give any more commands either. A puff of blue mist blew by, and when it cleared, a blue Budawang doll stood where Lingwen had once been. It wore a very serious expression, and it even seemed to be holding scrolls in its arms. Shilian picked it up and tucked it away in his robes, and then the two crept out of the side chamber and into the main hall.
Well, that's the go-to.
That is the go-to, it's funny. It wasn't just his imagination. The main hall of the Palace of Lingwen really looked more somber than before. The mountains of report scrolls stacked from floor to ceiling now seemed perilous, like they were going to collapse at any moment and crush anyone below dead. They didn't run into any guards as they sprinted straight for a set of vermilion doors at the heart of the palace. Before they even got close, Shilian heard a trembling, shocked voice. How is this possible? How could this be? It was the state preceptor. Could someone have gotten to him before they did? Shilian kicked down the door with a growl. Let him go! Sure enough, the state preceptor wasn't alone inside the side chamber. Everyone turned their heads to look at the intruder who had kicked down the door. The shock on the state preceptor's face hadn't faded. "Your Highness?" The state preceptor didn't look up at him for a moment, for more than a moment, before he lowered his head again. "Just wait a second. How can this be? What kind of luck is this?" Shilian and Hua Chung were both speechless. The state preceptor and 3 other people had formed a full card table inside the chamber and were in the middle of a heated round of cards, fully drunk on the game. Although previously stated to be 3 other people, his opponents weren't actually alive. They were very crudely made paper dolls. Who knew what kind of bizarre spell had been cast that allowed them to move and even play cards? But as for the state preceptor, his cries had only been laments about the hand he'd been dealt. Remember, that was his that was his thing. He liked to play cards, and Mooching didn't want to interrupt him that one time, and it was a whole thing. Shilian had expected the state preceptor to be a haggard sight to behold, that he might be suffering interrogation and torture. He hadn't expected the state preceptor to still be playing cards at a time like this. The whole scene instead filled him with bittersweet nostalgia, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How could he not be nostalgic? During his days at the Royal Holy Temple, whenever he and Feng Xin went to look for the state preceptor, 7 times out of 10 he would be playing cards. Cards, cards. Over 800 years had passed, but it was like no time at all as he once again watched the state preceptor play cards. Even the crazed passion on his face was exactly the same. The state preceptor stared unblinkingly at the cards in his hands and spoke without looking back. "Your Highness, you've finally come. Let me finish this round first." Shilian knew this was an old bad habit rearing its head. The state preceptor recognized no one in the midst of a game. After seeing the figure he cut at the Palace of Divine Might, this version of him was unbearably different. Shilian went over and tried to drag him away from the table. "Master, what do you think is happening now? Stop playing!" The state preceptor's eyes were red as he yelled, "No, don't! Let me finish! I'm almost done, just this round. Let me finish this hand, it's almost done. I might win this time." "You won't win! You definitely won't win!" Shilian cried. Thankfully, the round did end fairly quickly. Although the state preceptor had sworn he was going to win, unsurprisingly, he did not. He withdrew the 3 paper dolls with a wave of his hand and finally regained his normal calm demeanor. As he sat with poise, he said solemnly, "Your Highness, I knew you would come. I've been waiting for you." "It certainly didn't look like you were waiting for me," Shilian thought. But of course he didn't say so out loud. Respect for one's elders had to be maintained, after all. "I'm sure you have many questions," the state preceptor continued. Hua Chung leaned against the door frame. He almost looked like he was relaxing, but he was probably standing guard. Shilian sat properly before the state preceptor, matching his poise. "Yes." After a pause, Shilian asked, "First, I want to confirm. Is Zhenwu... is he really White No-Face, and also the Crown Prince of Wu Yang?" "There's no need for doubt," the state preceptor replied. "He is." "I have no relation whatsoever with the Crown Prince of Wu Yang, correct? Are we 2 completely separate people?" Shilian asked. "The only connection you share with the Crown Prince of Wu Yang is that he destroyed your home kingdom of Shenle." "But, Master, you once told me that you didn't know what White No-Face was, and that you were certain he was born because of me," Shilian said in a low voice. "Your Highness, at that time, I genuinely did not know what that thing was," the state preceptor replied. "And by the time I found out, it was already too late. However, I was not incorrect in saying he was born because of you." "What exactly does that mean?" Shilian asked. "And the question remains, why did he want to destroy Shenle?" Let me drink. The state preceptor looked at him in the eye. "Because of that phrase you said." Shilian was taken aback. "A phrase I said? What phrase?" "Body in abyss, heart in paradise." Shilian was speechless for a moment. Then he asked incredulously, "That's it?" "That's it," the state preceptor said. "That one phrase?" Shilian questioned. "What was wrong with it?" "Everything," the state preceptor replied in a low voice. "Everything started with that line of yours." Shilian could sense that he'd have a hard time swallowing whatever the state preceptor was about to tell him. He wanted to call for Hua Cheng, but before he could do so, Hua Cheng had already come to sit beside him. "You saw those murals at Mount Tonglu, correct?" the state preceptor asked. "I did," Shilian replied. "Were you the one who made them?" "Yes, that was me," the state preceptor replied. "Every time Mount Tonglu opened, I snuck in to prevent a new ghost king from being born, and to do whatever I could to leave some clues, to tell others the story of the kingdom of Wu Yang and its crown prince." "Why not just tell people directly?" Shilian asked solemnly. "Why use such a roundabout method?" "Your Highness, why do you think almost no one in the world knows about the kingdom of Wu Yang?" the state preceptor asked. Before Shilian could answer, Hua Cheng drew a conclusion for him. "Everyone who knew has been disposed of, right?" "That's right," the state preceptor replied. "I would be in danger of exposure if the clues left behind were too obvious, or if I spoke the matter directly. Anyone who learned of it might be utterly destroyed. It wouldn't matter how many lives he had in the end. He could level an entire city in 3 days. I'm sure you know I'm not exaggerating." Of course Shilian knew. And the ironic thing was, in the past he had been thankful that Jinwu had ascended to godhood instead of falling to ghosthood, for if he had not, the world would have fallen into chaos. "That is why I can't let him notice there are still people in the world who know," the state preceptor continued. "But I also can't accept the fact that I'm the only one who really does. I told myself that the truth would eventually be discovered by anyone attentive and brave enough. Since I cannot defy him, I should let fate take its course. I've been on the run for all these years, keeping hidden all the while. He's never been able to capture me, except for that incident 800 years ago, when I almost couldn't get away. He managed it this time because he discovered the murals I left behind in the Holy Temple within Tonglu's Crimson Forest, and because you correctly guessed his identity in the kiln. It occurred to him then that I might still be alive, and that I had left behind many things he didn't want people to know about." When they passed through the Holy Temple within Tonglu's Crimson Forest, he and Hua Cheng had found that someone had destroyed the last couple of murals, the most important ones. They both suspected that person was hiding inside the temple with them at the time, but they hadn't managed to find the culprit. Now that he thought back on it, there was a very real possibility that White No-Face was hiding in some corner of that temple. "But Master, why do you have to stay on the run?" Shilian asked. The state preceptor replied, "Of course it's because—" "Betrayal," Hua Cheng said. The word was a little hurtful. The state preceptor shot him a look, but Hua Cheng's expression did not change. "You'd betrayed him, didn't you?" "Pretty much. That about covers it." The state preceptor turned to Shilian. "Your Highness, how do I put this? Everything in the murals is true. The crown prince of Wu Yang was like the sun itself to the kingdom of Wu Yang. As glorious as you were as the crown prince of Shenle, he was many times more. My 3 peers and I were once his vassals. After the crown prince ascended, he appointed the 4 of us to the heavens, and there we beheld many celestial beings of all types of character. Without exaggeration, he was still the sun even in the heavenly realm, shining so brightly in the sea of gods that those beside him lost their color." As the state preceptor spoke, an unintentional flash of a smile curved his lips. When he spoke about His Highness, Shilian could see that he wasn't referring to Jinwu or White No-Face, but to that young crown prince from 2,000 years ago. "I think you told me a similar story long ago," Shilian said. "Did I? Your memory gets bad when you're old." "You did, but you didn't tell me he ascended. You told me that he died." "That's probably because I rather he hadn't ascended," the state preceptor said. "Was it because Mount Tonglu erupted?" The state preceptor didn't directly answer his question. He only said, "His Highness's spiritual powers were too strong." In a dream, he foresaw the future of Wu Yang as a sea of fire, and so he started thinking of ways to save his people. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have never let him do it, but none of us back then thought things would turn out the way they did. We simply believed that if people were going to die, what could be wrong with saving them? But things weren't so simple. It was impossible to stop the volcano from erupting, so the only option was to migrate if we wanted 0 casualties. But the affected area was too large. It wasn't just a matter of 1 or 2 cities. Nobles and commoners alike considered invasion the best method to claim new territory. Otherwise, no foreign kingdom would allow such a great number of people from Wuyang to take up residence inside their borders. However, to His Highness, invasion wasn't an option at all. War would result in bloodshed, which would lead to bloodlust. People could turn cruel and lose their humanity. Let me drink. Still, the kingdom of Wuyang dispatched troops. There was complete annihilation wherever the soldiers marched, since the objective was to make room for the future Wuyang migrants. The generals gave the order to massacre the citizens of other kingdoms. The more, the better. Blood flowed like rivers, corpses piled high as mountains. When His Highness found out, he was very angry. As you saw, he descended upon the battlefield and punished the soldiers of Wuyang. Shilian was intrigued when he realized that the one who did those things was a young Jinwu, and thus also a young white no-face. But he wasn't the only one who was angry, the state preceptor continued. The whole affair also angered the nobles of Wuyang and some of the common people. Many went to the holy temple to question His Highness. We only wanted to survive, we needed more land, and we had no choice but to invade those other kingdoms. What's wrong with that? The impact of this incident was far bigger than we expected, and it only escalated further and further. Some were already calling for the desecration of his statues and burning of his temples. But His Highness endured all of it. He said that he would die defending the kingdom if Wuyang was the one invaded. He would not allow the enemy to set a single toe across the border, but that we ourselves must never invade others. He earnestly implored everyone to abandon thoughts of war, and to wait until we finished building something, the Heaven Crossing Bridge. There was no more land in the mortal realm. Then he'd send people to take refuge in the heavens for a while, the state preceptor said haltingly. Although it was an inconceivable idea, all four of us believed His Highness absolutely. We were convinced he could do it. Or rather, we would do our utmost to support him in any endeavor he attempted. Of course, the other heavenly officials didn't feel the same. The entire heavenly realm objected to it. But His Highness endured it all. He took on 3 burdens at once: the ignorance and complaints of the nobles and citizens of Wuyang, the incessant outrage of all the gods in heaven, and the enormous undertaking of the Heaven Crossing Bridge. Huacheng snorted. The heavens objected? I assume it was more than simple disagreements. The state preceptor nodded slowly. If he'd faced mere opposition, it wouldn't have mattered, but... Shilian could vaguely guess what had happened, but he still asked, But? The bridge required an enormous amount of time and a staggering amount of spiritual power to build. His Highness couldn't be distracted at all, the state preceptor said. He essentially stopped going anywhere else, stopped doing anything else, and stopped listening to the prayers of his believers. He could only focus on this one massive undertaking. However, a God who can only do one thing will never be able to keep their followers. The first day he took on the burden of building the bridge, the people were grateful to him and remembered him. The second, third, and fourth days were the same. After a month, 2 months, they were still grateful and remembered him. But as time dragged on, things changed. The volcano hadn't erupted yet, but His Highness didn't do anything but silently conserve his strength. The people couldn't help but feel that he wasn't as powerful as he once was, or even that he wasn't as dedicated. It was inevitable that they'd begin to worship a new god at a time like that. The kingdom of Wuyang had a high population and abundant wealth, and its citizens were fervently devout. His Highness's impressive strength made that quite obvious. Many heavenly officials had long been salivating over his domain and the believers within it. Shilian understood. So the other heavenly officials took advantage of this opportunity. The people of Wuyang resented their crown prince after he descended and forced the troops to withdraw, and the heavenly officials used that to tempt them. In doing so, they divided his believers and weakened the source of his spiritual power. Right? It's not that His Highness didn't know what they were doing. He just didn't know what to do about it, the state preceptor said. Let me get a lozenge. Shilian inclined... Oh my god, bro. Shilian inclined his head slightly. He's a god, so of course he couldn't tell his devotees, I won't allow you to worship a god other than me. He would have scoffed at such a demand, too. He would have scoffed at such a demand, too. Naturally, you understand him very well, the state preceptor said. But it just had to happen when he couldn't afford to lose devotees or spiritual power, lest it affect the construction of the Heaven Crossing Bridge, Shilian added. That's precisely it, the state preceptor said. It was up to the four of us to speak to the people and let them know what was at stake. And how did that go? Shilian asked. Probably went nowhere, Hua Cheng said. Nowhere indeed, the state preceptor replied. At least, it didn't go nearly as well as we'd hoped. Some people returned as devotees, worried that the construction of the bridge might fail, but a large number thought that His Highness was being domineering. Their prayers were not being answered, so of course they could begin to worship other gods who would listen to their needs. They were free devotees. They could believe in whatever they wanted to believe. It was more than natural. It wasn't that he didn't want to please everyone. It's just that he... Shilian sighed and whispered. He had the heart, but not the strength. The state preceptor continued his tale. After His Highness learned of this, he told us to stop our efforts, that if they wanted to go, we should let them. They wouldn't be wholeheartedly devoted to him if they were kept by force. That was true, and even though we warned them over and over again, his devotees' hearts had already wandered. If they forced themselves to return, it would only be to placate us. Their belief would no longer be sincere, so its power wouldn't be as strong. He couldn't be angry at the devotees, and he refused to request the help of other heavenly officials, Shilian commented. Even if he did ask, the other heavenly officials would have never helped him, the state preceptor said. If they had been willing to lend a hand, they wouldn't have been against it in the first place, and they wouldn't have tried to lure away his devotees. His Highness became more and more silent, and closed off as he used his own powers to build and support the bridge. I watched him every day. Although he said nothing, I could tell just how much he was suffering inside, suffering that he had to bear alone. No matter how much the four of us wanted to help, we couldn't lighten his burden. Finally, after enduring all of this for 3 arduous years, it was time. The volcano was about to erupt. The moment the news broke, the people fought to swarm the bridge. As the four of us directed the frantic crowd, we worried about His Highness, as he was supporting the bridge all alone. The state preceptor sighed. Before that, we never would have worried that there was something he couldn't achieve. But at that time we did. While the bridge was quite stable at first, it needed to be supported for longer and longer, as the crowd grew larger and larger. His Highness's hands started to shake, and his face grew paler and paler. No one else could see him, only we could. I sensed things weren't right and told the people, please wait a moment, give him a little bit more time. Don't swarm toward him all at once, just let him catch his breath. He will definitely save all of you. But the volcano was about to erupt, and lives were in danger. No one was willing to wait. They all rushed onto the bridge like mad. Some were even trampled to death in the stampede. We couldn't hold them back. In the end, what we had feared most came to pass. Because we'd kept losing devotees over those 3 years, His Highness's spiritual powers were no longer as strong as they once were. Hundreds of thousands of people swarmed onto the bridge at once, celebrating their salvation. But as they approached the heavenly realm, the bridge collapsed under their weight. Shilian's breath hitched. The state preceptor continued to speak. The heavenly arch was shattered, and a crowd of millions dropped from the sky in an instant, wailing and screaming as they plunged into a sea of fire and burned to ash right before His Highness's eyes. I was completely stunned at the time and didn't dare look at His Highness's face. The bridge couldn't be repaired, the people couldn't be rescued, and the fire couldn't be extinguished. There was no way to help at all, and there were many more who hadn't yet made it onto the bridge, left behind to be entombed in lava and sealed by flying ash. Screeching, wailing, cursing. That scene was truly too horrible. I have never witnessed anything more horrifying since. Shilian tried to imagine the chilling display. The state preceptor continued his tale. The bridge collapsed, and the people of Wuyang went mad. They burned down His Highness's temples, toppled his divine statue, statues used blades to stab his heart until it was mush. They cursed him as a useless creature, a shit excuse for a god. He was a god, and gods should be mighty and strong. Gods couldn't fail, but he had, and so he could no longer remain on high. The officials in the heavenly realm had long been waiting for this moment. They said, "We told you it was impossible. You've caused a serious mess. We have no choice but to ask you to return to the realm below." And His Highness asked a very foolish question. Why didn't any of you help me? But why would anyone help him for no reason? And if they'd allowed him to triumph over this enormous tribulation for the kingdom of Wuyong, wouldn't that mean he would never again have a match in the heavenly realm? That's why it had been a very foolish question. I imagine he knew this, yet he still asked. No one answered him, of course, and His Highness was banished. He fell back to the mortal realm, no longer a god and no longer a crown prince. We followed him and assured him that he would certainly ascend again, and he began cultivating anew. But it was much too difficult. I'm sure you understand. Of course Shilian understood. The higher one stood, the harder one fell. After falling from the heavens to the mortal realm, only endless cold and malice awaited him. The volcano was still erupting, and the kingdom of Wuyong had fallen into a crisis worse than it had ever seen in all its history, the state preceptor continued. Refugees, rebellions, and invasions were incessant, and the people were at the end of their wits. Their attitude towards His Highness had deteriorated. It was entirely opposite from what it had been before. Even so, His Highness still wanted to help them. However, something else happened around that time. Many other heavenly officials began to show their grace. Even though they hadn't been willing to help save everyone from the volcano's eruption, they were quite happy to grant a little blessings, deliver a bit of medicine or food or other such things. Since His Highness was banished, his capacity to help was of course far smaller than those heavenly officials. It was as if the people of Wuyong had seized a lifeline, or seen their parents born anew. He lost devotees even faster, though honestly there weren't many left anyway. All the praise and adoration once reserved for His Highness alone was given to other heavenly officials, and only hate and rejection remained for him. The state preceptor closed his eyes. At the time, we had a hard time coming to terms with it. We were upset with the unfairness of it all. Those other heavenly officials hadn't helped the people that much, and they only appeared after the disaster was over. His Highness was the one who did the most. He gave it his all, and he should have been successful too. He just fell one step short. Why was he the one doomed eternally? Why was the one who had given the most ignored, while all the praise and gratitude was lavished on the ones who'd given nothing but trifles? That was also when my way of thinking began to change. I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if His Highness had pretended that he'd never seen the future in his dreams. If he had chosen from the start to sit back and observe on the grounds that the gods could do nothing to change the course of fate, and granted blessings after the volcano erupted, like the other heavenly officials, surely the people would have cried those tears of gratitude for him instead. Did that thought only cross your mind at that point? Hua Cheng interrupted, voice flat. You should have known from the beginning. If you slice off a piece of your flesh to save one person, that person will be grateful. But the more you slice, the more that person will demand of you. Even if you cut yourself down to nothing but bones, they will still not be satisfied. I didn't dare tell him any of these thoughts, the state preceptor said. His Highness grew more and more somber. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, had no idea if his feelings were the same as my own. Days passed, and the eruption continued. The entire kingdom of Wuyong was mired in terror, unable to escape. No one knew how to make it stop, how to end this nightmare. But one day, His Highness told us that he had found a way to calm the volcano. When he told us how, we had a huge fight. Let me guess, Hua Cheng said. The how was human sacrifice. Correct, the state preceptor replied. His Highness said that we could use a group of wicked degenerates as a sacrifice. We could throw them into the kiln to pacify its furious flames. The four of us each had different opinions about this, but the consensus was opposition. We would never do anything of the sort. In the beginning, His Highness didn't want Wu Yong to invade other kingdoms, precisely because he didn't want to use a life to save a life. How would sacrificing lives to the kiln be any different? It'd be even worse, in fact. The ones who were most opposed to the idea began to quarrel directly with His Highness. The argument was so severe that fists were thrown. I was against it too at first, but it was harder for me to bear internal discord in the same way I did the constant attacks from the outside. You must understand, the four of us had always supported His Highness, but by that point, we were his only support. And yet in the heat of the moment, blows were exchanged, and one of us even accused His Highness of no longer being the Highness of the past, that he'd changed, that he'd forgotten his heart. Those words truly executed his heart. I couldn't stand it. If even we opposed and berated His Highness, then there was no one left in the world who stood by his side. I didn't object to his idea in the end. I only told him to let it go and stop worrying about such affairs. The heavenly realm, the mortal realm, all the refugees, stopped caring about all of it. It was just too tiresome. However, no one listened to me. After that huge fight, the other three left. Shilian shook his head, not knowing what to say. He knew too well that leaving at a time like that was like adding frost to snow. Only I stayed behind, the state preceptor said. His Highness didn't say much when I did. He simply asked me, "Are you leaving?" The former Highness's expression when he asked me that question. At that moment I genuinely thought I'd understand even if he did sacrifice people to the kiln. I said, "Your Highness, I won't leave." His Highness still didn't say much, but he seemed to change his mind, and never mentioned human sacrifice again. He set up a ritual site near the kiln, and I accompanied him there every time, both of us enduring the curses and thrown rocks of the refugees as we conducted services to try to suppress the volcano's fury. I thought that would be the end of the story, but one day I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. The state preceptor's expression turned terrifying, as if he was once again seeing the same image that chilled him all those years ago. Shilian's heart felt like it was being squeezed tight by an invisible hand. What was it? He suddenly started covering his face, the state preceptor said. His Highness was handsome. He'd never hidden his face before, state preceptor said. And there wasn't anything that could have injured him. It was the first time I'd seen him like that in all our years together, so I was perplexed. I asked him, "Your Highness, what happened to your face?" He said he was accidentally burned. I didn't know when he could have suffered such an injury, and he wouldn't let me examine his wounds. He would only apply herbs on his own. After that, his whereabouts became unpredictable. That was unusual, but a wonderful thing happened that temporarily distracted me. The volcano began to calm. The kiln gradually settled into stillness, and did not show any further activity for a long time. Since His Highness had been the only one devoting himself to the matter, many people of Wu Yong thought that he was the one who had suppressed the volcano, and some began to worship him anew. His Highness's path of cultivation also started progressing more smoothly. At least there weren't any more people jeering at him or throwing rocks. They even gradually started smiling at him again. I still thought something wasn't right. There were many things that weren't right. While my three friends all had different personalities, I knew they wouldn't just leave and ignore everything going forward. Even if they were angry with His Highness, they wouldn't be angry with me, too. At the very least, they wouldn't have cut me off entirely. What was most unusual was His Highness's face. He kept hiding it. At first wearing rags and cloaks, then later a mask that he wouldn't remove for any reason. I even began to wonder whether this person was really His Highness. Sometimes I suspected an impostor, that it wasn't him at all. Everything about him had completely changed. The way he spoke, his behavior, his personality. Sometimes he was kind and dear. Sometimes he'd abruptly fly into a rage. There was an incident where he smashed all the mirrors in his room while he was alone. Everything was covered in blood. I didn't know where he had been hurt so terribly, or what manner of wound could have possibly bled so much. But even more horrifying were the strange voices I'd often hear. Voices? Shillian asked. Deep in the night, I could sometimes hear human voices coming from His Highness's room. It sounded like a few people whispering and arguing, but it was always just him in there when I'd go in and check. His Highness stopped allowing me inside after it happened a few times. One night, I heard those strange voices again, but this time, I noticed that they sounded like my 3 missing friends. I thought that they might have returned in secret, but why would they hide from me? I couldn't sit still anymore, so I got out of bed and ran into His Highness's room. Strangely, there really was no one there besides His Highness, who was lying on the bed wearing his mask still. I stood there and listened for a moment, and I heard the voices again. They seemed to be coming from His Highness. Or more accurately, they were coming from behind his mask. I crept to His Highness's bedside. The closer I got, the more certain I was that the voices really were coming from beneath the mask. Was His Highness talking in his sleep? Could he have missed his friends so much that he'd learned to mimic their voices in his dreams? I hesitated for a long time, and while I waited there, His Highness did not move. I assumed he was asleep, so I gently removed his mask, and I saw what was underneath. Unconcealable terror flowed from beneath the state preceptor's eyes. My 3 friends. They had been the ones talking, not His Highness. His Highness's face was mangled, covered in jagged gashes that had been inflicted by something sharp, his flesh mangled and smeared with half-dried blood. And there were 3 more faces growing on his own, mouths moving, opening and closing. They were their faces. Shillian shuddered. He threw the 3 vassals who left him into the kiln? The state preceptor didn't answer. He was completely submerged in the enduring terror the scene still evoked in his heart. Those faces hadn't seen light in a long time, he said. Even the moonlight was painful to them. When I removed the mask, they seemed shocked. They squinted and stopped talking. But after a moment, when they saw it was me, they began to call my name. I was completely stunned. Earlier I said that I'd never seen anything more horrific than millions of people plummeting from the skies and burning alive in a sea of fire. But the scene before my eyes at that moment was a million times worse. My hands shook non-stop as it held the mask. I probably would have dropped it on the floor and woken His Highness if I hadn't been petrified from head to toe, frozen in place. Meanwhile, those 3 faces seemed anxious to tell me something. The movement of their mouths grew even more erratic, but they still suppressed their voices, like they were afraid to wake His Highness. I was disgusted and terrified when I saw them, but I couldn't help but be curious what they wanted to tell me. So I held my breath, bent down, and leaned close to His Highness's face to listen. Coming so close, I could smell the thick stench of blood and rot that the medicinal herbs couldn't conceal. I heard them say, "Quickly, run away. His Highness has gone mad." As it turned out, the other 3 had still been worried even after they left, so they returned in secret to speak to His Highness. But when they found him, he was herding a crowd of people towards the volcano's peak. That was when they found out that His Highness had never abandoned the idea of living sacrifices. Seized by shock and rage, they attempted to stop him and began to fight with him. Yet unexpectedly, he savagely killed them and threw them into the kiln along with the rest. The ordinary citizens were, of course, burnt to dust and ash as soon as they were thrown in. But the 3 of them were cultivators, and they had been murdered by His Highness. Their resentment and attachment to the world was deeply profound. Their souls took his body as their host, and grew as legions on his body, venting their rage and berating him constantly in the hope of stopping him from pursuing his terrible endeavors. My horror and confusion mounted as I listened, and I didn't know what to do. I truly couldn't tell what was more terrifying, His Highness or those 3 abominations on his face. Right then, I felt a hand rest on my head. I stiffened. With great apprehension, I looked up and saw His Highness. I don't know when he woke up. He and the 3 faces on his face. a total of 4 sets of eyes. They were all staring at me. The expressions of those humans' faces became even more exaggerated, and as they twisted, they tore at the gashes on his face, causing fresh rivulets of blood to pour down. He stared at me for a long, long time, and then he sighed and asked, "Didn't I tell you not to come in here?" All at once, I understood his recent abnormal behavior. When he discovered those 3 creatures growing upon him, His Highness hadn't been able to accept it. He couldn't tolerate his inhuman demonic reflection in the mirror, so he smashed all of them. The blood was from his attempts to slice them off with blades. The stench of rot was coming from his wounds, which would not heal. But no matter how many times he gouged them from his flesh, they always grew back. The state preceptor covered half of his face, his pupils shrinking violently. I fell to my knees by his bedside. His Highness slowly sat up on the bed and said, "Don't be afraid. This happened to them because they betrayed me. As long as you don't do the same, I will treat you as I always have. As long as you are my loyal servant, nothing will change." But how could I not be afraid? And how could nothing change? Everything already had. His Highness is very smart. He'd never needed to change his behavior based on people's expressions before his banishment, but he had learned to observe them and do so since. He guessed what I was thinking, and asked me slowly, "Are you leaving me too, then?" To be honest, I didn't know. If he had only sacrificed those degenerates he once spoke of, perhaps I could have pretended like nothing had happened. I did say that I would have understood. But he had killed our best friends, and thrown them into the kiln with his own hands. Now we only had each other. This really was madness. I couldn't accept it. And then His Highness murmured to himself, "It's all right. I expected that. No one would stay now that I've become something like this. I can manage on my own. I understand now. I've always been alone. I don't need anyone." His expression turned savage, and he seized me by the neck with one hand and began to strangle me. He stared at me unblinkingly as he mumbled to himself over and over, "I can manage on my own, all alone, 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 alone. I don't need anyone, I don't need anyone, I don't need anyone, I don't need anyone." His Highness has incredible strength. If he had really wanted to kill me, my neck would have been snapped in an instant before I could even make a sound. But I didn't die immediately. The moment he started to act out, my 3 friends began to scream on his face. They'd done something to him, and the pain in his head made him start screaming as well. I also started screaming. The 5 of us were all screaming wildly, yelling like madmen, like we had all gone crazy. His Highness gripped his head with one hand as the other strangled me harder. My vision was growing dark. I couldn't hold on much longer. But then I saw something beneath his pillow. It was a sword. He had always hid it there when he slept. It was a habit he had developed during banishment. I caught hold of the hilt and yanked it out. The blade shimmered with chilling light. His Highness burst out laughing, his eyes blood red, as he asked me, "Are you going to kill me too? Come, stab me quick. Stab me right in the heart. You can add to the count. We can see who'll be the last left standing, you lot or me." Of course I didn't stab him. I only flashed the blade in front of him and cried, with everything I had, Your Highness, please come back. Look at yourself. Look at what you've become." He had smashed all the mirrors, and it had been a long time since he'd seen his own reflection. The blade was sharp and bright. It reflected his appearance, and he saw his own face. He was stunned by the sight of himself. The grip of His Highness's hand around my neck did not slacken, but he stared and stared. After staring for who knows how long, a line of tears suddenly streamed from one eye. When I saw his tears, I couldn't help but cry as well. That reflection on the blade, such ugliness. Just a glance had disgusted me, so why did I force him to look? Why did I remind him that he was such an ugly creature now? I couldn't bear it, and the sword fell from my hand and clattered to the floor. In the end, His Highness heaved me away and said, "Get lost." And I did, crawling and stumbling as I fled. Having listened to that whole story in one go, the held breath in Shillian's throat finally released. The state preceptor also lowered his hands. I ran as far as I could. and escaped the kingdom of Wuyang. And it wasn't long before the volcano erupted once again. This time, the entire kingdom was completely buried, and almost no one survived. An entire country gone, just like that. I escaped the calamity, but I never heard any news of His Highness again. It was as if he'd been buried along with the kingdom of Wuyang. We can stop there. That's halfway. And there's an image I will send. Aren't they gay as fuck?
Yeah.
He's like, I'll stay with you, even if you kill people, but this is a bit much.
Damn.
And like, he could have strangled him, but he didn't strangle him right away, and then they're gay. He's like, oh, you're gonna leave me.
Major crash out.
Gay people, gay people. Mom and dad are fighting.